we're going to be in camera. I had to put on grown-up clothes, right?
You're always very, very grown up and a model, a real model. And so Malik, at Dr. Small at his school, Regent Young, has done a lot of work around MBK as well. And has
camera had to put on grown-up clothes, right?
You're always very.
I guess one of the things we should do is figure out how we can exchange contacts.
Has done MBK as well, and has their TV on. You can't have the TV on YouTube as well because then you'll get the backlog.
Yeah, I
So
get
you
it.
can only be
I
on
get
the
it.
computer.
Well, in any event, Dr. Malik, at some point we need to connect so I could possibly visit
as well.
And get out of this.
Their TV on. You can't have the TV on YouTube as well because then you'll get the backlog.
Yeah, I
So
get
you
it.
can only be
I
on
get
the
it.
computer.
Well, in any event, Dr. Malik.
So I get the sense he's live. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm going to mute mine for 1 second.
Dr. Young, I missed what you just said because we had all the feedback.
Yeah, no, I was saying we should at some point exchange contact because I'd love to visit your school.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so we are live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Selma Bartholomew. Welcome to our launch of our webinar series. Today we are celebrating May 19th, Malcolm X Day. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and welcome individuals as they log on, and then we are ready to go and begin a dynamic conversation with our distinguished guest of panel members. For those who are just joining us, welcome to our community conversation. So we will have today Regent Young from the New York State Education Department. I'm excited to also welcome Dr. Malik Small from East New York Middle School, and Lena Anderson, President Emeritus of the NAACP, and also a member of our legacy team. So get your water, get your popcorn for those who are just joining us. Thank you so much for making time in the day to join us for our first legacy community conversation with leaders. So we're gonna give others out there in the community a minute or so to log on. I'm Dr. Selma Bartholomew, or Dr. B. I'm honored to have the pleasure of celebrating the legacy of Malcolm X Day today with a distinguished panel. We have Regent at Large, Regent Young, Dr. Small, and Lena Anderson. And so we will be starting officially in 3 minutes. I'm just allowing individuals to join us and to connect with us. And you will be able to contribute to the webinar. So make sure you can ask our panel members questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and we will certainly collect them. We do a lot of work on parking lots, so it's okay if we don't get your answer immediately on this live session today. I promise I will get back to you if you send communication, maybe your email, or subscribe on the Dr. Selma B show. We're excited once again. Welcome for those who are joining us. This is our first webinar series, Community Conversations with our leaders. And I'm excited to invite and to share and to have the opportunity to engage with a dynamic panel, Regent at Large, Dr. Young, Dr. Malik Small, principal of East New York Middle School of Excellence, and a real staple in the community, not only Brooklyn, grew up in Harlem and knows what we're dealing with firsthand during this pandemic. And we also have Lena Anderson, President Emeritus of the NAACP, White Plains Greenburgh branch. And I'm excited because Lena has also been a member of my team, and I've benefited from her leadership and her voice for more than a decade. Okay, I think we're now at 4 p.m. For those who are just joining, give us another minute. Welcome. I'm Dr. Selma Bartholomew. Welcome to our community conversations with leaders. And I'm going to now introduce our distinguished panel members and to give them a chance to share about their work and their legacy. So today we're celebrating the legacy of Malcolm X, born May 19th, 1925. So Malcolm would be 95 today. So happy 95th birthday to Malcolm X. Happy May 19th day. So this is a unique opportunity for us to celebrate a legacy that is often not celebrated. And so we have this special panel today to really discuss the legacy of Malcolm and make that connections to our community. We have a very distinguished panel members today. So first, let me introduce each of them and give them a chance to introduce themselves. And I'm going to ask them a direct question. So I'm going to start with a very distinguished guest, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to benefit from his voice and his leadership at the state level. So Regent Young is Regent at Large at New York State. He has more than 40 years of distinguished leadership and service and fight on behalf of all children, each and every child in New York City. He was a former superintendent in Community School District 13, and he's been a particular champion for all students, but also for our boys and our young men of color. So Regent Young, I welcome you, and I want to start to ask you an introductory question. Can you firstly introduce yourself and tell us, what does the legacy of Malcolm X mean to you in light of your service and your leadership?
Certainly. Well, thank you, Dr. Bartholomew, for bringing us together, and thank my fellow panelists for taking time to be here today. I think this is a very important topic and a perfect opportunity for us to really examine and relate the legacy of Malcolm X to what's currently happening across America and the globe. One of the things that I would say about the legacy of Malcolm X is I've always considered him to be a truth teller. And some have even coined the expression that he was a revolutionary truth teller. So the first context is that he was a truth teller. He told the truth. The second thing in my own experience and development, I recall Malcolm X saying that when a people are in the midst of a crisis, before they take any steps for self-improvement, they have to first get the problem right. And so the context for me, very simply, is this, that we are currently in a crisis.
Yes.
It's important that we tell the truth about how we got to this point when we talk about the disparities, because what concerns me is that I'm not certain that when we talk about it, that we're really not putting it in the context of the truth. So for example, in today's news, they talked about how you could associate the deaths from the pandemic with zip code, as if this is a new finding. I mean, we've known for the last 20 years that health disparities are associated with race, with zip code, ethnicity, as if income, and zip code. We've known this. So it's important for us to tell the truth. The other point that I would make is that it is extremely important in this moment that we get the problem correct. And so what that has meant to me in my career and my work, yes, I am a member of the New York State Board of Regents. I'm an at-large member, I'm a public school educator. But what I realized is that in order for me to make a contribution and to have an impact on the community that I love and work for, it was important to understand that we needed to target. One of the challenges that we've had with this whole topic of diversity is it's been our unwillingness to focus and strategically say that if our challenge is the underachievement, the disparities, what's occurring for males of color in America, then the only way that we could address that is by focusing on males of color. It just seems to me very clear. The other way that I would say it is, while we espouse to the concept of all, all has never meant all.
Exactly.
And so it seems to me that if we are intentional and we're focused, we can make improvements. And I think that's the legacy of Malcolm in terms of how I feel about him.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to now have the pleasure of introducing Lena Anderson. Lena is the President Emeritus of the NAACP, White Plains and Greenburgh branch, with a 40 plus career of advocating on behalf of community and advocating on behalf of each and every child. Her work in special education has been truly transformative. Lena, you also have a legal background, and I'm honored to also say that she's been a member of my team, and I've benefited from her voice for more than a decade. And I want to just remind viewers, welcome to our very first, before I let you introduce yourself, Lena, welcome to our first community webinar series. For those who are just joining us, we have Regent at Large, Dr. Young, Lena Anderson, Malik Small. Please note, you can send us comments, and you can also provide your direct information when you like the channel and subscribe. So please be sure that you're sending questions and comments as we engage in our community conversations with leaders today, and I will be sure to get to them. So Lena, and thank you so much. I'm honored. So Lena, as we think about today, this very special day, May 19th, Lena is also most recent recipient of the Betty Shabazz Trailblazer Award from Westchester Trailblazers. So I'm honored. So Lena, tell us about the legacy of Malcolm X and what it means to you and the communities you work with, and what might Malcolm be fired up about in this context of COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Dr. B, and my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be with you. I honestly find it intriguing, as our Regent Young said, that we are looking at disparities as though this is new news. This is not new news. And one of the issues, and I'm sure Malcolm would reiterate it, he would tell us, by any means necessary, his famous words, we have to be unashamed and unafraid in our proponent in terms of really advocating for Black people. We are so often considered people of color, but as the Regent so specifically talked about our boys, we have to continue to push for very purposeful solutions directed at improving the lives of our Black children and the education of our Black children. And especially during this time right now, this pandemic, we know they are losing. We know that they did not even get materials in a timely fashion, much less the evening of the playing field with electronic access. So we have our work cut out for us, and it's time that we as a community really had this discourse and came to an agreement on the strategy and how we are going together to focus and attack these issues so that everybody can benefit and we can raise up our level of functioning. I know as a special education teacher, I dealt so often with situations where kids were designated and felt a certain way just because they were labeled. But people who are in the classroom will tell you every time, everybody who has a label isn't necessarily that label. And there are many students left out in the mainstream who could benefit from the support that was afforded students who were labeled. So we've got to get away from having to segregate and label kids and talk about education in ways that we can talk about benefit. So I'm very much still an advocate, and I'll tell you, working with Dr. B and going into the city school is really a good visual on the two Americas. Because here in Westchester, teachers have a campus, they have a real teacher's room, they have a parking lot, they have the aesthetics that help students own into their education. Whereas in the city schools, where you have 8 schools in one building, and there's a lack of ownership of the very school itself, much less what it can deliver to the student. We have a huge mountain to climb to erase those kinds of disparities throughout the nation. Because in other states, I'm sure in the cities, the urban education is very different from the suburban education. And we're not talking about that. When they deliver these monies that are our tax dollars, and we're not fighting for more of that money to be distributed to our Black population, we've got to figure out that ask. And we got to figure out how to put our power, because we don't seem to recognize the power we have. And this is where Malcolm is so profound. Malcolm has said to us that we are more powerful than we know. And unfortunately, in 2020, that is still the case. So I'm all about, let's have this conversation, move forward in a way that we are harnessing our power methodically for change.
You're muted, Dr. B.
I'm honored. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Small. For those joining us, I'm Dr. B, Dr. Selma Bartholomew from Legacy. I'm excited about our community conversations. We have Regent Young with us, Lena Anderson, and I have the pleasure of introducing a very dynamic principal, a very transformative principal, Dr. Malik Small, who works in a community that is extremely hard hit at this time in East New York, and has transformed his building into a space where young people want to be, a space where parents are welcomed. And so we're honored to have him and his more than 14, 15 years of experience as a principal, as a leader, working in different settings in the public space, in the charter space. So Dr. Small, thank you for joining us. Thank you for making time today as we celebrate the legacy of Malcolm X. And I wanted to ask you, as we begin, what does the legacy mean to you as a principal? And what also do you want it to mean for your students, given in the communities you serve?
Well, good evening, Dr. B, and thank you for having me. Malcolm said, education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. When I think about the legacy of Malcolm X, what I think about is he represents the transcendency of the human spirit. He represents the very best that all Black men can be. Here's a young man whose parents were Garveyites and who suffered at the hands of racism. Young man who, as a child, his teachers told him he would never amount to anything. A young man who grew up and ultimately took a path that led him into and onto that pipeline to prison that we're all so familiar with, but he didn't let that destroy him. He was the consummate teacher and the consummate student. He became a student when he was in prison and came out and transformed his life and transformed his spirit and transformed really a world and a people. And so when I think of Malcolm X, I think about African-American, a Black man who left for us a blueprint and a roadmap for resiliency when it comes to Black boys and Black men, for grit and for Black excellence. And I think it's his life and legacy, which we can use to teach our young men in schools that, you know what, your zip code doesn't have to determine where it is that you can end up being. And so when we look at his life and we look that he led a life that was intentional and purposeful, these are things that we can use to teach our young men. His spirit still remains as a blueprint, as a living model of whatever young Black man can be, despite all of the things that we have against us. He reminds us that when we look at this pandemic that we're going through, it reminds us what racism really is. Racism has nothing to do with what people see as he doesn't like me, she doesn't like me. Racism is institutional. When we look at institutions, and right now particularly looking at the institution of healthcare and how it has failed us and how it is failing us, and as a result of it, how our people are dying at a rate that far exceeds other people. we can look at his life and we can look at some of the things that he left to us as a lesson to use to continue to battle on the front lines of erasing disproportionality, erasing disparity, and really doing what's right for our people at this time so we don't have to continue to suffer at the hands of institutional racism.
Thank you, Dr. Small. As I think of it, as I was planning this conversation with the team, and I think about the legacy of Malcolm X, I grew up in Harlem, and I see Malcolm and Betty, and there's a love story there, right? There's this love story that's never told, that our children don't get to learn about. And I also think about it in the context of our current work around curriculum and our fight to have a more culturally responsive curriculum, which fears, creates some fears for me, because I'm nervous that, the big guys, they will just put a picture of Malcolm on a page and then claim that it's culturally relevant curriculum and culturally relevant pedagogy. But for me as a mathematician and growing up in Harlem, that X means a lot to me. That X, the ex-con, the ex-addict, if you, remember Harlem in the 80s and the 90s and the crack epidemic that we had, that variable of the X as a mathematician means a lot. And I see it as an opportunity to get our kids to become curious about who they are and to become curious about curriculum and to show them that math is this language, right? That he chose this very powerful letter. Math says something. That's okay. Which says something about, what he was looking forward and letting go of and claiming at the same time. So as I think about the legacy of Malcolm X, I think about it in the context of a love story, but also in the context of the X, the letting go and then claiming something new for the future. And I'm hopeful that in this time, that as we move forward, we can look at the legacy of Malcolm and think more about our children and what does it truly mean to have a culturally relevant pedagogy. I want to ask a question now about what do we envision that our parents would have to do in extraordinary ways to now truly be responsive and to help them to close the gap that they are experiencing. We have so many parents who are working from home and everyone now is a parent. So what do you think we'll have to do now to help our parents become extraordinary? Dr. Young?
Well, the first thing is, and I think parents are experiencing this all over the state of New York, there's a very uneven information distribution system. So what we now know is that many of our parents are not armed with the information that they need to, in fact, help their children. And so we have to do a better job of ensuring that parents have the information that's necessary. So for example, when we talk about remote learning, I mean, it's a very interesting concept, but if you go around and you ask people, well, what exactly does that mean? You get a variety of definitions. And so for example, if you go to Westchester County and you talk about remote learning, you're gonna get one answer. And if you go to Wyandanch, or if you go to Ocean Hill, Brownsville, you'll get another answer. And so one of the things that I'm finding out, for example, is that if you go to some of the more preferred places in the state, when we talk about remote learning, we know that young people are engaged in remote learning. They're interacting with teachers. They are receiving the appropriate guidance. They have access to reliable hardware, software, and the internet. And if you go to other communities, that is not the case. And so what can parents do about that? And so there's this lack of what I call the appropriate information. So I think if one thing we could do is try to figure out, number one, how can we get parents the information that they need? Number two, here's the other thing that I experience every day. Every day I receive emails. I get at least 30 emails saying, try this new software. In the age of remote learning, try this new, and so here's what's happened. This stuff is coming at us unfiltered, right? And everyone is trying to figure out, well, what should I use? What we now know is that there needs to be an opportunity for someone to say, well, who's in charge of this? Who's actually directing this, right? Who's actually screening these materials? And who is saying to parents, if you really want to support your child's instructional program, here are the things that you need to have in your home. And here's how you could obtain these things. And here's where you go if you need assistance. And if your child doesn't have access to a teacher during this age of remote learning, here's what you can do. Here's who you can go to. And here's how you can get an answer. And I think, to me, we don't have that now. So I think that would be one of the first things we should talk about how to do.
I'm going to ask Dr. Small next. Dr. Small, no one expected to be remote leading, right, at this stage, and everyone are leading in this virtual space. As a leader and as a principal working in this urban setting, you now have commonality and shared experiences with someone. We work, for example, in North Dakota with that principal out there. Certainly there are settings that are different, but has your assumptions changed in any way about leadership in light of COVID-19 and in light of what you've had to do to lift your school community to an online setting?
Well, absolutely. When you think about the role of the principal, and I always make a differentiation between principal and leadership. For me, leadership is a behavior, right? And so we've had to really take our leadership to the next level, because what's required as a leader in this time of COVID and in this remote setting is something a little different than the type of leadership that is called on in the brick and mortar setting. And so one of the things that I think is at the top of the list in terms of leadership really is developing a really astute emotional competency, because parents and teachers, and let's keep in mind that so many of our teachers are also parents. And so while at the same time they're delivering instruction remotely to the communities and the children in the communities that they serve, they're at the very same time delivering instruction to their own children at home. And so taking that into account and really looking at the leader as someone who is really there to be very supportive and very kind of flexible, and it's really asking us to be so many different things, having to deal with the grief of loss, both on the teacher side and as well as the children's side, and making sure that the organization, because we lead organizations, don't falter. And so really as a school leader, really just holding a mantle of emotional competency, as well as technical competency, as well as academic competency, so that we continue to serve as a lifeline, a virtual lifeline, not only for the school communities and professionals who are serving the children, but for the parents also, because parents are also now, in the same way that our teachers have become parents, have to parent at the same time, our parents have to become teachers at the same time. So training them around how they can best support their students at school, and then also being just an ear for them. I have virtual coffee with my parents on a weekly basis. And when I get on the line, they don't really want to talk business, and neither do I. They just want to say, hey, it's good to see someone else other than these people we see in this house, right? And so navigating, all of those fine lines between how do I support you emotionally, how do I support you spiritually, while at the same time flying and building this plane that we come to know as remote learning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Small. For those who are joining us to our community conversations with leaders, that was Dr. Malik Small from New York Middle School in Brooklyn. We have Regent Young from NYSCD, and we have Lena Anderson, President Emeritus from NAACP, White Plains Greenburgh, and also from the Legacy team. So for those who are joining us, please do share your comments, share your questions. I'm hoping that we can get to as many of them, as some of them as possible. And please be sure to share your information as you subscribe and to like our channel. I want to turn to you, Lena, next. So we're talking about assumptions, and you've done so much work on behalf of community and advocacy. Do you think assumptions have changed in this virtual space about engaging community? And if so, how do you see those assumptions now as we move forward?
Well, the largest change is in our support systems. We used to assume the community centers would be places of refuge, places of resources where they could go and seek the technology that they may not have had in their homes. We used to think that churches were going to be available for space and for other kinds of conditions of study to improve the ability of them to have resources outside of the home to help with homework and after school programs and things of that nature. Now that that has changed in terms of availability of resources, the challenge of our organization is, what do we do to make up for that? And it's a true challenge. In some cases, we have harnessed some videos, things that we thought were useful and that would help in terms of when you talk about sifting information that's out there, we make recommendations on things that they can use. But the broader assumptions that we will be there, that we will personally be there, are tougher to achieve, much tougher.
I agree. As I think about the assumptions, and we're based in the Bronx, but we work with schools nationally and in New York City. I was surprised that even though the rhetoric is around virtual learning and everything is virtual, I was really surprised and disappointed when, for example, in New York City, the summer youth program has been canceled, right? So the impact on that, on our communities, is significant, and we haven't seen the true impact yet because we're still in quarantine. But I thought to myself, hey, we as an organization, we can work with our young people to train them in a virtual space. We do that every day in our models as we help kids learn how to be leaders. So even though we're being told to move forward in technology, the fact that the thinking hasn't adjusted yet to truly say, how can we create opportunities in the virtual space? And our work in STEM really matters, right? That this is a unique opportunity to truly embrace STEM and to truly empower our young men and our young people with what it could mean now to be in this virtual space. So I think assumptions, to me, I was surprised that assumptions didn't shift, that we still think of, okay, summer youth as what it was in the past, rather than reinventing it and thinking of something new in this virtual space. Dr. Young, your thoughts about the assumptions and how they may or may not be changing?
Sure. One of the things I would say, just on to your point, hopefully most of the viewers know that I have some involvement with the state's My Brother's Keeper initiative. And one of the components is what we call the My Brother's Keeper Fellows. And fellows are high school juniors and seniors. And fellows from across the state are involved in a series of leadership activities. And the New York City fellows as recently as a week ago, had selected as one of their leadership topics to come up with a set of alternatives to the fact that there would be no summer youth employment. And we had an online session with the deputy mayor, Commissioner DYCD, representatives from the Office of Management and Budget, et cetera. But it was just amazing to hear these young men talk about the opportunities. And the way they couched it was that summer youth employment, it wasn't just about jobs, it was really about learning. And it was about how they could use the current circumstance as a vehicle for them to engage in internships and other learning opportunities that would enhance their own futures, right? And it was just very interesting to me that as they talked, you know, and listening, I said, well, the first thing we ought to do, one of the assumptions that we've been under is that we all know what's best for young people. And I think at this point, we have to engage young people. We have to give them voice, and we have to give them a say around matters that impact them the most. The other assumption that I think we need to challenge is this notion that we can meet this crisis, meet this challenge with what we currently have. What we now know in all of the places where I see young people learning and engaged during this crisis, it's because the professionals have made a personal investment in these young people's lives. They've gone way above and beyond. So every teacher that's listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. The hours that they put into planning and preparing and reaching out to students at night and trying to find students who aren't logged on, all of that suggests that if we truly will for each and every one of our young people to be successful, we have to make a personal investment. We have to go above and beyond. We can't think about schooling as something that's from 9 to 3. If anything has taught us something, that we have to think about the school day, the school week, the school year very, very differently. So it just seems to me that the old assumptions, you know, let's make the children, the students conform to our structures, has to change. What we have to do is say that the structure has to conform to the needs of our communities.
Well said, Dr. Young, thank you. And thank you for sharing around the work of the My Brother's Keeper initiative. For those who don't know, MBK is an initiative out of the Obama Foundation. New York State is the only state to adopt it through education, where other communities might be doing it through juvenile justice and other programs. The fact that New York State has made a commitment for young men of color and our boys and young men of color through education is exactly what Regent Young is speaking to, that relationships matter, and we know that. And in terms of our work, you know, when we work with teachers and work with our students. I want to ask Dr. Small, as you think about this virtual space and moving forward, Dr. Young mentioned that we have to change our assumptions even about time. So we have this, traditional 180 days of school, and we had snow days. How is this, how are you rethinking or reimagining the upcoming school year? And what might you see as your greatest challenge, as we think about loss, as we think about settings, as we think about relationships? What might you see as, as the future, as we think about?
Well, I would say in every crisis lies opportunity. And I see this crisis really as being something that has really opened up a world of opportunity around what can be done with technology. And so I'm already in the plans of creating some strategic plans around blended learning when we return, because we can no longer just go back to our traditional way of teaching and learning. I also want to say, you mentioned the MBK piece in New York State. Not only has New York State done amazing things around putting it into schools and school districts, but I believe they're the only states who have funded it. So there's the difference to make. There's one thing to make a commitment. There's another thing to make a financial commitment. So New York State has made financial commitments around MBK. So I think that should also be noted. So again, when we think about assumptions, right, I think that the whole COVID-19 thing has really changed how we're looking at the work of schools and the work of educators Before COVID-19, we were under the assumption that children went to school primarily to learn and to do well on their ELA and their mathematics exams. We now know that that's not entirely true. We now know that the education system really is inextricably connected to so many other things, because if you watch the news every day, they're not speaking about math scores and English scores. They're talking about parents have to go to work, right? And so schools have a whole nother function that we really didn't think about. Schools serve as a place where children can go so that the rest of the world can operate, right? And it just so happens that when they get there, we have an opportunity to take advantage of some teaching and learning. But also, we also realize that teaching and learning isn't the priority in a sense right now. The priority is, are our children safe? And so when we ask teachers to engage students, when we ask teachers to do continuous cycles of outreach, it's not because we're trying to get Johnny in class to pass the test. We want to know if Johnny's safe. We want to know is his family safe. And when we speak about safety, we're speaking social, emotional, physically, so forth and so on. And so, you know, just rethinking the priorities around how it is that we care for the whole child and that entire child. And so I think a lot of what's coming out in this pandemic is our priorities around what the school, the education community is about in terms of children. And I think that there's so many other things that we have to do to ensure the safety and security of children before we're able to teach and learn. And I think that COVID-19 and this process of remote learning is really leaving that impression and changing those assumptions for us.
Thank you, Dr. Small. And as I always like to remind our leaders and our teachers in this work, we have to have compassion. We have to truly have compassion for ourselves, and we have to have compassion for our children and for our families. So I have two questions from the audience I want to address. And first, Lena, I want to go to you, because as we think about virtual learning, yes, it is absolutely helping to close the gap. And as Dr. Small mentioned, to be able to just keep checking in on our children, right? Are you okay? And there's an African proverb that they say that when they greet you, the first thing they ask is, how are the children? How are the children? Yeah. But we know that not just in New York State, across our country and globally, we have children with special needs. We have children with diverse needs, and there have been so much litigation on the fight to be able to have them in inclusive settings, and now they're home. They're right. Home, and right. Yes, our schools are making a giant and Herculean effort to be able to provide those services through virtual learning. But what are you thinking, Lena, as an experienced special educator? What are some of your concerns as you now think about the needs of special education children in this space?
You know, it's even broader than just special ed children, but what has to happen? The village has to expand. And as an advocate, I have always hoped that people who we helped, who the NAACP went to bat for, especially in education, where I sat through hearings and voir dires and went to bat for parents whose children were being treated unfairly. And at the end of the day, when we went back to those parents to say, now we need you to sit in the next one for the next person, those parents weren't always available. And that's what we have to get to the bottom of, is how do we broaden the village so that everybody feels some responsibility for everybody else's child? And teachers, in terms of being parentis and locus, have always extended themselves, even beyond their own children. They bring that love of their children into the classroom. I remember feeding kids breakfast before the breakfast programs. And when it comes to the special learners, their learning styles are different, yes. And right now, their needs are different. Parents are now having to deal with that in a way they never have before. So they also need the emotional support. I don't know how we can talk about delivering that to them, because in many households, counseling is not really readily received. But there is a grand need for mental health counseling across the board. And we have to figure out in education how to filter that in. And very often in our schools, those clinicians were the first ones cut, the first ones dispersed to an unsurmountable level, caseload. But we've got to rethink that. And even before we talked about caseloads and things like that, we were looking at schools a little differently because the current scheduling, as our regent pointed out, was based on an agrarian culture. And so that 10-month a year was meant to allow students or young people to be available in the summers for other kinds of work. But now we've got to think about worldwide competition and maybe having schools throughout the year and throughout the day, sort of figuring that out. And what I've seen some parents do in this pandemic, they started out trying to be very structured, waking their kids up at 7:30 and having a very structured day until 3. But then they found themselves not quite knowing what to do. We've been in it so long now that some of those parents have learned to massage that and to become more flexible and to maybe let the older students sleep a little later and the young ones who are up already start their education earlier. Yes. And the broader educational world has to do the same thing. We have to think about how to accommodate the youthful age, then the teenage, et cetera, and meet those educational needs. So the special students should be compensated in the same way. I never really like to see them pulled out and treated differently because of their needs. I think we have to keep them in the mainstream. We call it inclusion technically, but they should never have been excluded. They should always be included. And then we work our educational process so that it meets their needs while we're also meeting the others. I'm not saying it's easy. I am saying we have to be very purposeful in addressing it.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to take some questions from the audience. My first question I'm going to direct to Regent Young. This one is from Dr. Michelle Darby. Thank you, Dr. Darby, for joining us. Thank you so much for joining our conversations. Dr. Darby said, while we're speaking on the impact of Malcolm X, could you discuss the school to prison pipeline? There are students who are doing well in the traditional setting, but what about our children who, for example, may be in juvenile justice right now, who may be taking part in education in incarcerated settings? What about those children and that pipeline? So Regent Young, your thoughts, especially as you engage in the MBK work?
Certainly. Well, there are several aspects to that question. There is, and everyone knows, there is this notion of a school to prison pipeline, but essentially the pipeline starts when young people don't have access to the kinds of educational opportunities that will lead to their success. One of the things that we know about young people that end up incarcerated is that they weren't doing well in school. They were having lots of challenges in school. And so there is this relationship between not doing well in school and ending up in the system. The other point that I would make is that there are requirements that say very specifically that if you happen to be in a detention center that doesn't release the state from its obligation of providing a young person with an education. The challenge becomes what type of education and what are we educating them for? And so what I would say, and again, not to get too granular on this, but the first thing we have to understand is that we spend $67,000 a year per young person, for every young person that's incarcerated. Just think about that every year, the state of New York spends this $67,000 to keep one young person locked up. We don't even spend a fraction of that to educate kids. So there's still places in New York where the average per capita education spending is somewhere in the range of $13,000 to $14,000 a year. And so just think for a moment, if we could flip that a bit, if we could take just half of that $67,000 and put that in education, think about the number of young people who would not be locked up. So I think, yes, there is a pipeline, but I think there's a solution. right? I believe that that it doesn't have to be that way. And again, it goes back to something I started out with. We've known for years. And in fact, we've known since I've been in education that the vast majority of young people that end up incarcerated, they come from certain communities in New York State.
Yes.
I mean, that's no secret. So we know where they come from. We also know that those are the same communities that have the lowest educational outcomes for young people. We also know that those are the same communities that have the highest unemployment rates. They have the greatest health disparities. Okay. They have the greatest, lower life expectancy rates. So all of we know these things, but yet there isn't a focused, intentional effort to concentrate on those communities to ensure that young people have what they need so that they don't end up. It's not enough for us to say there's this school to prison pipeline. I mean, there's reams of research on it. There's more books have been written, more articles have been written on this that I even want to think about. But it hasn't helped us because we still have it. It still exists. And so the real question becomes, to me, how do we put in place a set of prevention measures, right? Which means focusing on those communities where the disparities exist to figure out how we can provide them with an equitable distribution of talent on the part of staff, with an equitable distribution of physical resources, dollars, with an equitable distribution of opportunities. They need to have the same thing that the young people who are the highest achieve.
Yes.
Right? And that's, to me, that's how we have an impact. I'm not certain if I answered the question.
No, I think it's an honest and passionate, it's passionate, and it reflects your years of experience and expertise. Before I go to the next question, which is actually for Dr. Small from our viewers, let me just make sure and thank our viewers. Thank you for joining our community conversations. Be sure to subscribe and like, and to send us your questions as we try to get them to the panel. As I hear you, Dr. Young, as I reflect on this work and the intentionality for us as a company, I think also as my perspective as an entrepreneur, and I have actually worked with children in group homes and children who are incarcerated. And I think we've got to now really think about family, and we have to be mindful of the fact that if you're in that setting, then most likely you have a break in tie with family. You may not have a family to advocate for you. You may not have someone, even when you are released, to go back to. And so when you don't have family, and we do have programs in our communities, but things that our children can truly rely on, that we now have to be more holistic in our approach. And also for me, as I think about this work, it's also financial literacy. And so we're moving in a new direction, because I realize that if we don't have an economic engine in our community, and yes, there's all of this money that's going towards educating our children, but it's not going back into our communities, right? And so it maintains the school to prison pipeline when we're not able to have an economic agenda that is intentional about the work and what we're trying to change in our community. So for those who are viewing, thank you for joining our community conversations. Dr. Small, we have a question for you from the field. This is from leader Vanessa Grennan, and she says that we make decisions, but we always make decisions for youth, but rarely invite them to the table to hear their side. So can you talk a little bit about your work and what it is that you do to invite students to the table, and what might you now be envisioning as we move forward after this pandemic?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. Before I answer that, I do want to piggyback off of what Dr. Young had spoke about in terms of the school to prison pipeline. And keep in mind, with any pipeline, pipelines are designed to move a commodity from one end to the other end. So on one end of this pipeline, you have communities of Black men and families. And on the other end of that pipeline, you have the prison industrial complex, which benefits and feeds their communities and their children off of the commodity, which is the failure of education for students of color, for Black and brown children, right? And so they've monetized the failure of education, right? And so for me, one of the keys to education is something you mentioned earlier, which is culturally responsive education. And so when you think about cultural competency and how cultural competency serves as the immune system, so to speak, of any of a healthy body. You cannot be healthy without cultural competency. And so one of the key ingredients that's missing from many schools is that culturally responsive education. And without that, you're going to continue to perpetuate failure in the school and feed the pipeline, which then feeds the families of those involved with the prison industrial complex. But to go to your question, children are partners in our school, right? You have teachers, you have administration, you have children. 9 out of 10 of all my decisions are made with children at the table. Children sit on most of our committees. In my school, children sit on the attendance committee. They sit on leadership committees. I have a student, and I'm in middle school, and I have a student representative on the school leadership team. And so for me, what we have to recognize is that children are just younger adults. They're little people. And so when we have a fundamental respect for the fact that children know much more than we give them credit for, when we have a fundamental respect for the fact that children have something that us as adults have lost, they have intuition. They have this pure sense of what's right and what's wrong, and they want to be heard. And when you bring children to the table, as I do at my school, let me tell you, it just makes your job easier because they come up with some of the most fantastic ideas, and they will tell you exactly what it is they need and how they need it. And so we routinely make sure that children sit on all of the major committees in our school, and we respect their voice. And it is a double-edged sword, because when you give a youngster voice, they're going to use it. They're going to talk back. They're going to say, Miss such and such, you know what? I don't know if I agree with that. But it's that voice that we have to nurture and we have to champion, because children are just little people, and they're going to only be little people for a very short period of time. So what we do around taking advantage of that and instilling in them that resiliency and that grit and that excellence, because we give them voice, they'll take that and they'll do amazing things with it. And you couple that with cultural responsive education, meaning those who control the images control the minds of our children. When you got a youngster that can look in a mirror and see Black excellence rather than Black failure, you're going to see a young person that's going to go out and change the world.
Well said. Well said. And so, Lena, before I go to you for your question, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Small. And for our audience members who are listening, Dr. Small, like I have to say to you, I've seen you and we've worked together, and truly transformative that your school reflects that vision of excellence. Your students engage in everything from dance. You, before anyone was thinking about how do you bring movement and life into a school, you've always created that space. They dance, they drum, they are debating, they're doing the things that's not just about, right, the standards. Yes,
and even remotely, we're bringing to them a full cadre of arts. Remotely, we have a tap dance class, we have a hair braiding and makeup class, and we have just several arts offerings that we're bringing in addition to the academic offerings, because again, it's very important that we nurture that whole child and take advantage of whatever the hook is that we can use to bring them in and get them interested and engaged.
Yes, and so I thank you. And then the academics is there. So his school has been doing the lab day model and have kids working and leading in math and taking and developing their voice. I'm going to do one final question for Lena. I'm going to remind people to please subscribe, because this is our kickoff for a series of webinars. Our next one is May 28th. And so Lena, can you share a little bit about this voice piece and bringing parents into the discussion, because oftentimes parents' awareness is not the same thing as parent engagement. So can you share a little bit about what does parent voice mean to you, and how do we begin to bring them to the table as we wind down our first webinar series?
Well, I am so happy we have come full circle, because with Dr. Small's comments and Regent Young's perspective, maybe they will agree with me that what we do in special ed, which is called an individualized educational plan, is something that should be adapted for all students. An IEP would allow that sit down with the parent, with the child, with the relevant teachers. If clinicians are necessary, of course they could be there, but I think that annual sit down can be rescheduled as often as needed. It would bring parents in to really address the needs of their individual child and have the child have the input for himself. And where there are groupings that are possible after those plans are done, those groupings could be made to benefit all. But I think if every parent knew the benefit of an IEP, they would all want one. It gives them an opportunity to say what they feel their child needs, but let's have the child also say, this is what I think, Mom, at the table, and then have it codified so that this is what the school agrees to do. So I really do like Dr. Small's approach, and I think it's very much on its way to being more individualized, even though right now he's working with kids participating on larger committees. I agree that is the way to go. I do think the individual IEP is something that every child could benefit from, and that would allow parents to troubleshoot better and advocate better for their children. And where a community representative is needed to voice the parents' concerns, someone from the NAACP could join that conference, and it would not be confrontational. It would all be to better the whole process of planning for this child. So I do think that is the way to engage parents.
Thank you, Lena. Before I go to my last question, as I think about what you shared, Dr. Small and Regent Young and Lena, for us, absolutely, our work as a company is about ending the social reproduction of failure. How do you get working class kids to only want working class jobs? We've got to give our kids the opportunity to see, right? To see themselves in a Regent Young, to see themselves in a Dr. Small, to see themselves in Lena, to begin to really envision and dream for our children. We're coming down to a close. For those who are still with us, please make sure if you do have questions, do put them up. I promise I will go to them, pull them together for our panel members, and absolutely post and shared by email. So make sure you subscribe, and reminding individuals that this is a launch of our community conversations. Our next one is on May 28th. We've got Dr. Pepper Martin from Destiny House Church in the Queens and Long Island area. Cynthia Williams from the Harlem Renaissance Education Pipeline, who'll be here to talk about parents. And then we have Dr. Derek Skeet, who is an author of Break Through the Chains, and a professor from Medgar College, who'll be here to talk about building family and community. One last comment, and I'm going to ask each of our panel members, our distinguished panel members, to respond. What do you think Malcolm would say to this? To this open-ended statement? What would Malcolm say that we need to fill the gap? If we had to fill the gap for our students, what would you now, as we close out, what would he say to us? How about I go to Lena? What would we fill the gap with? What would Malcolm say?
Fill the gap with confidence in our kids.
Thank you. Dr. Small?
Again, I'm gonna continue to push the notion that culture responsive education. You can't put cats in the oven and expect to take out biscuits, right? You gotta have a recipe, and there's a recipe for Black excellence, and we have many examples. So teaching our children about those examples, whether it's Malcolm X or W.B. Du Bois and so forth and so on, that's what's gonna enrich and empower them, and that's what's gonna get them to be successful in any and all of their endeavors.
Thank you. And our distinguished panel member, Dr. Young, fill the gap.
Well, I think there need to be more opportunities for those of us who have the expertise and the knowledge base to be involved in influencing the decisions that impact our own lives. I mean, what I think Malcolm was all about was this notion of unity, doing something for self. And by the way, that's part of our legacy in Black education in America, that whenever we were able to make some progress, it was because we were engaged, fully engaged in coming up with the solutions that impacted our lives. So I think there needs to be a movement afoot that will bring us together to ensure that our voices are heard when we talk about reimagining education for New York State and New York City.
Thank you, Dr. Young. I am Dr. B. I think for me, I certainly agree with everything that you've said. And as I look ahead, I think we need to fill the gap with an economic agenda. I know that, for example, this year is an election year. We have several seats up. And I think we need to shift our thinking that we can't begin to have an education agenda or political agenda without an economic agenda. And we need to now begin to help our kids become more financial literate. We need to help them to see themselves as entrepreneurs, to see and to envision, right? And what it is that the quality of life that they want, and to begin to empower them with economics and also our community with an economic agenda, because then we can then drive what we need in education and in the other spaces. So for me, I think Malcolm would want us to fill the gap with an economic agenda for ourselves and for our communities. We have come to a close. This has been a dynamic discussion. I've learned so much from you, Regent Young, Dr. Young. I thank you so much for giving your time and your energy to this discussion today. Lena Anderson, President Emeritus from NAACP, White Plains, Greenburgh, thank you so much for making time, also for sharing your voice and being such an advocate for children and for families. And to Dr. Small, please give our love to the entire East New York Middle School of Excellence community. And we know you also work beyond those borders. And we thank you. We thank you for your leadership. We thank you for being there for your families and for your students as they go through this very difficult time, and to be a touchstone for them. For those who are listening, thank you so much for joining us for our first community conversation webinar. And we look forward to you tuning in to our next session on May 28th, same time, 4 p.m. And that session is titled Building Family and Community, a Part for Everyone. And so we look forward to connecting with you again. Wishing everyone well. Please stay safe. Please stay safe and check in on our children, check in on our seniors, and remember to have compassion for yourselves. I'm Dr. B, and once again, thank you so much. Be sure to like and subscribe so we can connect with you afterwards. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.